Welcome to The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, shipping price pressure, why you could soon be paying more for food, toys and electronics.
We've seen probably a 20% lift in rates in the last 12 months.
And leading the charge, the unique strength First Nations collaboration brings to the Australian economy.
For every dollar spent with an Indigenous business, it created over $4 of social impact.
Well, consumers could soon be paying more for goods as shipping costs continue to rise during the COVID recovery. Surging demand for products and materials and a shortage of containers has sent freight prices skyrocketing around the world. So much so, it now costs more than $13,000 to transport a container from Asia to Europe. Local importers fear shipping firms are profiteering, as Sue Lannon reports.
More than a year since the start of the pandemic, business is booming at this plastic and glass supplier in Western Sydney. But high freight costs are keeping owners Jane and Casey Pearson awake at night.
So we've seen a 20% lift in rates in the last 12 months. And that depends on the region. So out of Europe, it might have been even, 50%.
But some clients are paying even more.
We've got a customer from the UK. Now they're seeing more than 840% increase. So once you open it...
Government stimulus checks and coronavirus restrictions have driven the appetite for products. But that has caused a global traffic jam at the world's ports.
It's obviously COVID impact, huge demand for more shipping, so increased demand, but at the same time, reduced capacity.
Over the past year, the median cost of shipping a 20-foot container from Australia to China has increased to nearly $1,500. The most expensive route from Shanghai to Rotterdam has soared 500%, with a 40-foot box now costing a record $13,500. And the price of transporting those containers from Shanghai to Sydney has doubled to more than $5,500.
Australia is predominantly an importer of goods, so you'll have an excess of empty containers over here. And our shipping lines, I can tell you, in the last 12 months have been working tirelessly in getting those containers out of this country.
That means some vessels are being used to pick up empty containers instead of transporting goods.
We've got one major exporter now who is very happily, with finally getting rains after years of drought. They've got a bumper crop of 20,000 tonnes of chickpeas, but they can't get capacity on any vessels to get to overseas markets.
The director of the Freight and Trade Alliance says the container crisis is challenging global supply chains.
A struggle to get them back to the manufacturers back in China and other parts of Asia in a timely fashion.
Shipping companies have cancelled trips to some ports to speed up journeys, and not enough containers are being manufactured. Shipping Australia boss Melwin Narunha says Australian ports must take some responsibility.
There's a build-up of these empty containers right across the world because of port congestion. And I think port congestion needs to be looked at very carefully.
Some vessels have been unable to dock in China because of trade tensions. And a blockage in the Suez Canal by a huge container ship in March has added to delays. Major retailers like Woolworths are paying more to get imports. The Reject Shop says those costs will be passed on to consumers.
So what we do need is just some level of regulation to make sure that pricing here isn't artificially being inflated.
There is absolutely no economic justification to regulate the shipping industry. It's a huge industry where you have multiple players competing against each other.
The shipping squeeze has affected all sorts of products, from building materials, iron ore and consumer products. For a business like this, it's added hundreds of thousands of dollars to shipping costs.
Jane Pearson says her business has also been forced to put up prices.
There's only so long that we can absorb those costs, so reluctantly we did go to market with an increase earlier this year, but it was a heavily subsidised increase.
She expects those costs to last for the short to medium term. A price hike now being loaded up the supply chain.
To markets which wiped off early gains, the All Ordinaries down by 0.3% as investors remain cautious ahead of US inflation data due tomorrow night. And the Aussie dollar is buying just under 77.5 US cents. James Rosenberg from Baillieu Holst joined me after the market close. And James, another market record today, but the ASX 200 pulled back at the close.
It did, Kath. We started off pretty strong. The expectations coming into the end of the financial year are for very strong reporting season. We've seen a very benign confession season, very few companies coming out and warning about earnings. So the market was quite strong, not a lot of leads from offshore, but late in the session there was a bit of profit taking. Market's been on a bit of a tear for quite a while, so with sort of thoughts about interest rates rising sometime in the future, bit of profit taking is not a big surprise.
And we had some economic data out both here and overseas, which failed to impress.
It did. The consumer confidence data was a little bit weaker than expected in Australia, but maybe not a massive surprise given the continued rolling lockdowns in Victoria. I think if you take Victoria out of the numbers, consumer confidence and business confidence remains very high across the nation. In China, producer price index was 9% rise. It was the biggest rise since the GFC, and that comes on the back of a 6.8% rise in April. So very, very strong numbers, but we should be mindful that they're coming off a very low base. Similarly with the GFC, cycling very, very weak numbers. So the strong numbers we're seeing are further evidence of the V-shaped global recovery. It has got some implications for consumer price inflation in China, and that may put the brakes on spending, but that's for the future. At the moment, things are booming along, and we're seeing that with Australian commodity prices.
And a couple of the banks here today upgraded their growth forecasts.
So we talked about the V-shaped recovery. That's happening around the world, and Australia's no different. Retail's booming, construction's booming, even domestic tourism is booming. Everywhere around the nation, there's very, very strong economic recovery. That will play well in the broader nation's economic numbers when they come out. I mentioned earlier more companies coming out with profit upgrades than downgrades. And an example was Brickworks today, the biggest brick manufacturer in the country, had an investor day very warmly received with record numbers, both in Australia and in the US. Construction very strong. Some forward-looking data like demolition numbers are quite strong, and that's suggesting that there'll be continued strong construction. And a bit of a bellwether for the broader economy. That stock was up 11% and really goes into that narrative of a strong economic recovery and the expectations of a big GDP print.
James Rosenberg, thank you.
Pleasure.
Murrowa Law is a 100% Indigenous-owned firm with over 80% First Nations staff and a similar percentage of women. Founder Leah Cameron says the Indigenous business community is not dissimilar to the wider business community, but is very focused on social impact, and that for every dollar spent with a First Nations business, over $4 of social impact is created. I sat down with the Supply Nation Indigenous Businesswoman of the Year during Reconciliation Week and asked how her cultural identity informs the way she runs her business.
I suppose my intent was twofold. The first was to provide Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with legal advice which, was culturally appropriate and allowed them to determine for themselves what they wanted for their futures. And the second part, I suppose, was in relation to providing government, commercial entities as well with assistance when doing business with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
So how has your cultural identity and heritage informed the way that you run the business, and how is it different to other practices?
Look, I suppose it goes to our values and our core of the way we do business. We are very unique. We're made up of over 80% Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff. And when we're giving our legal advice, we don't just look at the black and white on a piece of paper. We're really focused on, longer term relationships, and making sure that everyone at the table, is on an equal footing and happy with the end result.
So what do you think is unique about the Indigenous business community when you compare it to the non-Indigenous business community, and how big a part does that play with the overall economy?
Well, I think the Indigenous business community is, in a lot of ways very similar to the wider community, but we are also focused on social impact. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses are more likely to employ their own mob. They're more widely likely to give to the community. For example, in our practice, we're very focused on pro bono services. Supply Nation released a report some years ago called the Sleeping Giant Report, and they said that for every dollar spent with an Indigenous business, it created over $4 of social impact more widely.
So how impactful do you think are businesses like yours on breaking down these long-held stereotypes?
It's very interesting because our practice plays in, a commercial setting. So for the first time, it's bringing a different perspective with different lived experiences. So that's one change. So we're also by being in the room and being in negotiations, we're influencing, broader change across the sector and across the country.
And your business continued to grow throughout the pandemic. Did that exceed your expectations? And how do you propose to leverage that momentum?
Interesting as it is, COVID has created a huge difference in our business. Moving to an online platform has created opportunities for us to pitch for work which were otherwise quite difficult. Our business is regionally headquartered in Cairns, so it was a lot of effort to pitch for that work. But in the context of COVID, we also had the Black Lives Matter movement, and we also had the Juukan Gorge disaster, which really, I think, focused people's attention towards, well, we need to do better in this context. We really need to try to understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewpoints and respect what they're saying.
How is the federal government's Indigenous procurement policy supporting the Indigenous business community, and how important is this program and any others for growth in this sector?
Mm-hmm. Well, the procurement policies, I suppose, represent a hand up rather than a hand out, and it allows us to determine our own destiny in a lot of ways. We are very good business people, whatever sector we're in, and the IPPs across the country, both federally and in each of the states and territories, encourage, government, big corporates to look beyond normal supply chains and understand the value of generating impact with Indigenous businesses.
What government measures would you like to see announced and offered to really kickstart or kick along the sector?
Look, I really think it's great to have the IPP in place, but internally, in large commercial organisations in government, I believe that we need key performance indicators to hold people accountable. I also think we really need to drill down on Indigenous businesses in terms of if they have joint venture arrangements in place, to see that the Indigenous business partner is truly benefiting as well from the arrangement, and there is a long-term capability transfer so they can stand on their own 2 feet.
How far do you think we've come, Leah, as a nation in supporting the Indigenous business community, and how far do we need to go?
It's quite interesting. I think, government and corporate have embraced the idea, and it's not new and scary anymore. I think individuals across the country now, that's where the mission should be in terms of explaining to people, look, when you are buying items, think about investing ethically. If you're buying presents, can I buy a present for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander business? Can I buy my stationery? Can I buy my legal services? Can I lease my vehicle? There are so many options out there, and I think it's great if people look beyond just convenience to see what we can do to really benefit local communities here in Australia.
Leah Cameron, it's been great chatting with you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And that is all from The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Thanks for your company. Good night.